Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, sisters and brothers, all genders and identities. My name is Yvonne Weldon. I am a Wiradjuri from Cowra here in New South Wales, from the waters of the Clare, which later became known as the Lachlan, and of the Murrumbidgee Rivers. I am a representative of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, who are the culture authority under the Aboriginal Land Rights Act for the land this building is standing on. I would like to pay my respects to all elders past and present, to all First Nations, to you and the ancestors of the lands that you've travelled from. A welcome to country isn't just words. It is a reflection of where we are. Not this modern day structure, but the continuous link of life, lessons, purpose, and nurturing supplies. The boundaries of our traditional owners are not defined by the hand or by the pen, but through the natural landscapes of the earth. The Eora Nation's country covers the Hawkesbury River in the north, the Nepean in the west, and the Georges River in the south. On behalf of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, the elders, and the members, I welcome everyone to the lands of the Gadigal. I acknowledge the Gadigal people, whose spirits and ancestors will always remain with these lands, our Mother Earth. Wherever we travel across this beautiful continent of ours, understand you're entering the lands of nations, tribes and clans existing here for over 65,000 years. The First Nations of this country are the most resilient, unique, sustainable people on the planet. We are the world's oldest living culture. And traditionally across these lands and our waterways, we traded and we shared for necessity and not for empires. Our sharing and our trading brought our people together. It encouraged our sustainability, creating our innovation and keeping our ancient practices alive for our future and for everyone's future. There are many Aboriginal warriors that have crossed this land before all of us, creating pathways before there were any. And to give respect and honour, could you all please pause for a moment to remember the many sacrifices that have been made along the way, the ones we'll continue to make, and those we shouldn't have to. As you connect, learn and share, today, tomorrow and beyond, all of us, we need to connect more and to be linked, to make that positive difference for others, for self, for now and for the future, for everyone in this country. Don't lose sight of the important work that we all need to still do to bring my people, your people and all our peoples together. Don't live regretting what we should have done, but create a legacy of what must be done. Let's make real changes and not just symbolic ones, working in partnerships equally, creating an inclusion and acceptance and our resilience. All of us together can bring about positive changes to multiple generations. So whether you think about the land, our culture, our history, or the devastating impacts of past and current times, or even the resilience of my people, know that the answers to the questions for everyone in this country should always commence with the voice of Aboriginal people first, because we are the first people of this country. We cannot start to heal if we are not recognised, if we are not included. So think about the difference you are and you can make today, and what was not done on October 14 to make that difference for generations and generations. We need to now keep trying to work together in all to do what we truly can walk together for an all-inclusive future. We need to create that legacy through our healing and not create further devastation when we need to heal some more, and we should be preventing that devastation that should never have taken place. So with that said, let us all draw upon my people's spirits as we continue on our journey. May my people's spirits walk with you and guide you as we strive forward for us all. Again, on behalf of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, Ninyini, Nala, Wongan, Mari, Bajari, Gadi, Nurda, welcome to Gadigal. This always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Thank you and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Yvonne, for that welcome and your gracious words. Greetings. My name is Josephine Inkpin. I'm Minister in Placement here, and I offer greetings on behalf of the Christian faith community which meets in this space and which I'm honoured to serve as Minister in Placement. We're delighted to host this event and indeed the series that this is part of, as part of our own commitment to walking together for genuine truth, justice and the renewal of creation in these lands we currently call Australia. As a church community, we realise that we need to listen and learn so that all may be renewed. As an Aboriginal Anglican priest said to me over 20 years ago when I first came to these lands from England, many of us are still trying to live here off bread from far off countries that has long become stale in its journeying, as well as toxic in many aspects of its past and present. So unless we all learn to live from what we receive from country here, I think that none of us will ever really thrive. Our church community here has long been committed to being a place where we seek theological and spiritual food which will sustain us today in the contemporary world, and not just reheating stale remains. But we are increasingly aware that this needs to be done on a much more radical and much more decolonised basis than in the past, and led, crucially, by those who are best placed to guide us. So we are immensely thankful to support the work of the University of Divinity's School of Indigenous Studies, which is nurturing such vital theological and spiritual sustenance for First Nations peoples and for country as a whole. In my view, this work is the most vital of all in these lands, for if this were to flourish, most other crucial things that we have to face will be transformed, including the challenges and opportunities of climate change, of wider inequalities, and of the celebration of diversity. So I give thanks for all those willing to share with us in this, and for all those who've put this together as a collaboration, and for all of you who are here today in person or online. Let me conclude my introduction with a few practicalities. As you probably found, we're a little bit challenged today because there's a big protest in the city, so well done getting here. If you need to leave, the main entrance is through there. There are two side entrances, and that one there it is all access, disability access. The toilets are to the back of the building. You can get through that door or you can go through the corner there. And they are currently labelled in a binary gender manner, but urinals are in the first one and not in the second one. And then there's another toilet through there which is for all access through the kitchen behind me, signed through there. There are volunteers to assist if you need help of any kind at the back or also online. So let us all listen deeply, engage, and enjoy.
Thank you, Josephine, for your lovely welcome. And thank you, Yvonne, for the beautiful welcome to country. I feel very welcomed. That's beautiful, and I'm sure all of us here today do as well. It's my privilege to introduce this series and introduce Gary. I'm Kate Scholl. I am a member of the Eremos Council and also a member of this congregation. This event and the next two events in our series has its genesis in the conference Raising Our Tribal Voice, an Indigenous Theological Revolution, held in Melbourne by the School of Indigenous Studies at the University of Divinity in February. Inspired and challenged by that experience, Josephine and I began to strategize about how Pitt Street and Eremos might work together to enable Sydney folks and beyond to experience a taste of that conference. With the enthusiastic support of the Pitt Street Uniting Church congregation and the Eremos Council, Listening to Country, an Indigenous theology and spirituality series was born. This three-part series aims to open participants to some of the wisdom, knowledge, and direction for living that Listening to Country offers. Folks from the St. James Institute and the Wellspring community heard of our project and expressed their desire to sponsor and support the series as well. So we have members here today from Wellspring. Will you just raise your little hands and say hi? And if you're online, just wave online if you're Wellspring folks. We have folks here from St. James Institute, and the people, oh wow, look at all the hands there. Fantastic, welcome very much to you, and their director, Paul Oslington. Eremos is also well represented, so you want to say hi, Eremos folks who are here, and online, be sure to wave to each other online. And also Pitt Street folks, you're all, yeah, very, very well represented. So it's lovely to see everyone here today. In creating the series, we collaborated with Gary Deverell and Dr. Ann Patel-Gray from the School of Indigenous Studies, and they're really helped us to shape this series, this event. Information about the three groups and Pitt Street is in the back near the entrance of the church. So please feel free to have a look during our afternoon tea this afternoon and take any literature there that you're interested in. It has truly been a collaborative effort, but I really want to give special thanks to the Pitt Street congregation for hosting us and enabling the live stream and recording of this event, as well as all that's involved in making this space available. You have been incredible. When I first heard Gary Warite Deverell speak about Christ as country on Radio National's Soul Search program last year, I was deeply moved. And his presentation at the conference was equally powerful, challenging, and just opened up so much for me, and I know for the people who heard him speak. So we were very keen to have Gary to open this series, and so delighted that he has agreed to do so. Reverend Dr. Gary Deverell is an academic dean, lecturer, and research fellow in the School of Indigenous Studies at the University of Divinity, which he helped to found. A Truol man from northern Lutruwita, which is Tasmania, Dr. Deverell is the author of Contemplating Country, Gondwana Theology, and the Bonds of Freedom. He holds undergraduate degrees from the University of Tasmania and the Melbourne College of Divinity, and a doctorate in theology from Monash University. Among his many talents, Gary is a skilled liturgist and has taught courses in liturgy and preaching at Trinity College Theological School and the Uniting Church Theological College. Gary's more recent research has turned towards theologizing the experience of Indigenous peoples within and beyond the colonial church. Gary is a member of the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Anglican Council, the Doctrine Commission of the Anglican Church of Australia, and the Australian Academy of Liturgy. Gary speaks about how he has been able to weave together the wisdom from two different stories that he has grown up with. For him, country is about the interconnectedness of all life in a matrix of mutual care. We look forward to hearing more about this, so please join me in welcoming Gary Wara de Devereux as he speaks with us about Christ as country.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Joe. Thanks, Aunt. I first want to acknowledge the creator ancestors of this sacred and unceded country. And second, acknowledge the Eora nations and their custodial elders. And thank them for holding on to the old traditions and passing them on, that country might be honoured and respected and loved. In my language, Milaithina Nika Milaithina Mana, this land is our country. Waranta Palawa, Milaithina Nika, this country is us and we are this country. Ya Punlinya, welcome. So there's going to be some slides as I talk, and because I don't have a clicker, I'm just going to say, next slide please. Next slide, please. There we go. Thank you. So today I'm really wanting to talk about two traditions of thinking about our place in the world, in the cosmos, our place with the divine, if you like. One tradition, of course, is the European theological tradition, which came to this country with missionaries and with others a bit later on, which really emphasises the incarnation of the divine Christ as a human being. There are really three parts to this tradition, and I'm being really summary here. This is what people write very large volumes of systematic theology about. So, everything I say here will necessarily be heretical. But very first thing I think about that tradition is that the divine Christ becomes a body as an individual human being, who we know of in this tradition as Jesus of Nazareth, right? So a Palestinian Jew 2,000 years ago in the now contested lands of Palestine and Israel. We have writings which bear witness to what he said and what he did, and the church's conclusion about those writings that sort of developed over a number of hundreds of years was that you could find out about the divine in a very special way by attending to what you can see and hear of Jesus of Nazareth. But then the tradition went on to say that the divine Christ becomes a body, becomes real, becomes touchable and tangible, also in this communal body known as the church. And there are all kinds of ways of talking about this, but essentially the idea is that the church, at least in theory, has this vocation which is to be Christ for the world, to be the hands, the feet, the voice of Christ in an ongoing way, where Jesus of Nazareth is no longer, in fact, visible or present to us. And so the church becomes a kind of a substitute Christ, albeit in a fairly communal sort of way, involving lots of people rather than just one. The third part of that tradition, I would say, is about the neighbour. And so the European Christian tradition says that Christ can be found in Jesus of Nazareth and in the texts that bear witness to him, that Christ can be found in the communal body, which is the church and all that it does. But thirdly, that the Christ can be found in the neighbour in need. And of course, we're thinking here of texts like Matthew 25, whatever you did for the least of these, my brethren, you did for me. So that kind of idea that in some sense we can meet this divine Christ as we encounter our neighbours, however identified. So there you go. I've summarised the entire Christological tradition from Europe in roughly 3.5 minutes. Inevitably, I've left many things out. But the other tradition that is in play in this country, and indeed has been here for a lot longer than that European tradition of Christianity, is in fact some traditions around what we now call in Aboriginal English country. And these are very, very old traditions. I mean, if you think about the arrival of a 2,000 to 5,000 year old tradition from the Middle East via Europe to Australia, that only kind of got going here about 235 years ago, what we're talking about on the other hand, this longer, deeper tradition, has arguably been in play here for 5,000 generations. So we're talking millennia before the pharaohs and so forth. So this other tradition, which is still relatively new to many newcomers to this country, and when I talk about newcomers, I mean anyone who's come here in the last 235 years, this is the older, deeper tradition that is really very different in all sorts of ways. And here, if you want to talk about divinity at all, we're talking more about some kind of primordial reality, some kind of pattern which is in play in the cosmos and in the world, which has come, I guess, more latterly to be called something like the dreaming in Aboriginal English. Now, the origins of that term are both good and bad, and I don't want to have an argument today about the appropriateness of the word dreaming. I just want to recognise that's become a bit of a catch-all for a whole range of ideas about what the primordial reality or pattern might be that comes to us in the concrete reality of what we then call country. And there are a number of dimensions to country that I want to just talk about very briefly. So we'll go to the next slide, I think. Yeah, we just did that bit, so next bit. That's all right, we'll stop there. So, Aboriginal tradition focuses on the incarnation of the primordial reality, the dreaming, as country. First, in the idea of a patterned cosmos. So, it's not just chaos. It's not like everything just sort of accidentally comes together and seems to hang together for a while, but then falls apart. And then, you know, it's not like that. It's not chaotic. For us, country is about all of reality, including the stars above, the earth beneath, and there's a sense that there's some kind of patterning to this. And this comes out in the way that we actually organise our societies. Our societies traditionally were organised in order to, in some sense, be a mirror of this patterning that we understood was in play in the whole of the cosmos. Secondly, this idea of the primordial reality becomes country as things like earth, air, fire, and water, which will be familiar to all of you who are studiers of the Greek tradition and Heraclitus and so on. Earth, air, fire and water, these are seen as, if you like, sort of basic building blocks of reality, which we still encounter in this country. We'd want to third talk about creator ancestors. Now, creator ancestors in Aboriginal thinking are kind of, they're kind of like super beings. They're partly animal, they're partly human, and they are the ones who come to us from various places. So, for example, my folk talk about Moyani, who arrives from the Milky Way and comes down the pathway of the Milky Way to Earth. And Moyani is sort of like a wombat spirit. And Moyani is said to create a number of other beings, including the very first human beings that we call Palava. And Pallava originally was kind of a kangaroo human sort of creature, and but had a bit of trouble with the legs. So Moyani put us into a deep sleep and made the legs more bendy. And then when Pallava woke up, there was a kangaroo. So my totem is a kangaroo. There's a sense in which we have a particular relationship and responsibility towards what is called the eastern grey kangaroo, or the Pallava. So these creator ancestors are said to be the ones who shaped the land as we have it now, and in many cases they still dwell within the land and continue to speak to us through the living creatures of that land, but also often what Westerners assume is inanimate life, like rocks. But for us, these are alive with the presence of these creator ancestors and continue, if we have the ears to hear and the teaching to understand, to speak to us and guide us. Of course, a fourth dimension of that is what we like to call our furred, beaked and scaled cousins. That is all the other living creatures who are not humans, but in our way of understanding have the same value as human beings, and indeed are part of our family, our community. And so there's a sense in which all of those creatures need to be protected because all of them have value and all of them continue to be part of the living community of creation. And finally, and almost as an afterthought, there is human community. That is law and culture. So the kinds of things that humans do, the way we communicate with each other, the way that we represent reality, whether that be in art or culture or language or whatever. All of those things that familiarly human beings do, that's all part of country as well. We are part of country. We are embedded in it. So what you might conclude from that is that this is a different kind of tradition which has as its basis not the human being primarily, but the cosmos, country itself. So this is much more than human beings. The divine is encountered in all of reality and not primarily in human beings. So can these two traditions talk to each other? I really hope so. I think if we can't talk to each other, then it's game over in this country. So I really hope we can. And I'd like to suggest, I suppose, a few ways in which that might happen. But I want to have a little excursus first and talk about this concept of analogy, because to my mind, the way that these two traditions can talk to each other appropriately and respectfully is via this pathway of analogy. The good thing about analogy is that it recognises that human beings do not experience reality as it is, but rather as it is rendered or mediated through language and culture. That is, because of our formation as particular people in particular places with particular communities, languages, pre-existing cultures, which very few of us choose, we just kind of wake up in them. We're thrown, as Heidegger said, into these places. We are formed with a whole range of assumptions about what the world is and what the cosmos is and our place in it and all of that kind of stuff. Analogy reminds us that none of that is necessarily true in a universal sense. That all of that gives us a particular pair of glasses through which we look at reality and we make a bunch of interpretive conclusions. But we could very well take off that pair of glasses, and some of us get to the point of wanting to, and putting on another pair of glasses and recognising that actually there's a whole bunch of colours that we didn't know were there. There's a whole heap of shapes that we didn't know were there. There's a whole heap of thoughts and forms that we didn't know were there. But you have to take off your pre-existing set of glasses and put on another set of glasses to notice that. This is just a way of saying that that reality is mediated, and it's mediated by all of these experiences that we have, particularly, actually, the neuroscientists tell us, in the first 12 years of our life, which often sets us in a particular way of encountering the world. The other advantage of talking about analogy as a way of these two traditions talking together is that analogy looks for resonances and commonalities in the way reality is rendered by different traditions. So analogy is all about comparing like or as, comparing two realities, comparing two traditions, comparing two ways of seeing or hearing or experiencing the world. And so through that comparison, sometimes we hear resonances in what the other person is saying, if we're listening carefully, and what we're saying. And that can be a site of exploration, which is a good thing. Common space in which we can operate. But even though there's those resonances that we might pick up on, analogy does not allow us to conclude that other tradition, which is not ours, is just a lesser version of our own. Which is actually what the colonial imagination does, or alternatively, the fundamentalist imagination does. It seeks to notice resonances in other ways of looking at the world, but then absorb those into the home tradition and say, that's what that other thing really means. And Christian missionaries were always saying to us when they arrived, that story you're talking about, what that's really talking about is this story from the Bible. And that's the colonial imagination. That's still the dominant form of imagination in this country. Experience otherness, but absorb it into the home tradition so that it is rendered the same rather than keeping its distinctive otherness at the same time. Analogy warns us against that and asks us to be cautious as we have our conversations. So the proposal is, which is the next slide, thank you. The proposal is the phrase, which is an analogical phrase, Christ as country. Now, this doesn't mean that Christ is country, right? I want you to hear that really carefully. This is not to say that Christ and country are the same thing. This is simply to set up a point of conversation or comparison using like or as. Why is this important? Well, because if Christ is to be loved and worshipped by, say, Aboriginal people, my people, Christ needs to actually make sense within our frameworks, our own social imaginary, and not just in the social imaginary and frameworks of the colonist. It needs to have some sense of resonance for us because our traditions remain important and remain distinctive and remain unique. As our social imaginary is actually centred on country, our place within it and our responsibility for it, a Christ worth worshipping and loving for us will need to be located in the humus, that is the dirt of country, rather than in the humanum, that is human beings, as the centre, which is what the European tradition mainly taught us. So this sets up the possibility of Aboriginal people looking at the European traditions about Christ and seeking to find there in what I call the marginalia of the tradition, not necessarily the main thrust of the tradition, but in the marginalia of the tradition, perhaps some sites of resonance and conversation where we and they and thee can have a bit of a conversation. So let's have a go at this. Next slide, please. So, happily, there are traces of Christ as country in received Christian tradition. And really, what I'm doing today is I'm talking to colonists. I'm talking about folk who've come here in the last 235 years and have this European imagination. And I'm saying, here's some things in the traditions as you've received them, which may be sites for conversations that you can have with the spirituality of Aboriginal people, if you want to, right? So I want to talk just today about 5 possible sites where this conversation might take place. And in summary, Christ as cosmos, Christ as seed, Christ as staple food and drink, Christ as ancestral voice, and Christ as teaching custodian. So let's have a brief look at each of those in turn. So I'm going to quote the Bible today, which is not something that I necessarily do a lot, but today I'm going to be quoting the Bible a lot, because it seems to me that no matter what branch of the Christian tradition you're part of, the Bible is kind of one of those places where all the traditions at least claim that they're bouncing off the same material. So I'm going to quote the Bible. So you'll be aware, some of you, that there's this this letter called Colossians in the New Testament. And at chapter 1, verse 15 and following, you can read this. Christ is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him, interesting spatial word there, in him, all things in heaven and on earth were created, things visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or powers. All things have been created through him and for him. He himself is before all things, and in him, again, that spatial imagery, in him, all things hold together. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he might come to have first place in everything. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him God was pleased to reconcile to God's self all things, whether on earth or in heaven, by making peace through the blood of his cross. Now, obviously, in the background here, there's a radically different cosmology in play in lots of ways. The idea of Christ as somehow being the head of a body, for example, is not something that Aboriginal people would be remotely interested in, right? But on the other hand, any way of reducing that echo? On the other hand, there's a number of things in this cosmology that I think our mobs would certainly want to talk to and address. So, for example, here Christ is not merely an individual human being, however special, nor even is Christ just a corporate community of human beings, such as the church. He is also, in this cosmology, a cosmic body in which all things, that's all things, there's nothing excluded from this, all things, all creatures, both dwell and are related to each other. So to put it plainly, Christ is the cosmos. Okay? Now, this is not a new thought. This is something that European and Western theologians have been talking about since at least this passage, but certainly in medieval work, particularly people like Meister Eckhart, but more latterly, of course, in the work of even very neo-orthodox theologians like Hans Urs von Balthasar or Karl Barth. Very blokey European fellows, but they were talking about this stuff. So it's by no means new, and I'm not claiming that it's new. All I'm doing is I'm pointing out that there's some resonances here for Aboriginal people. So in Aboriginal dreaming stories, our Creator ancestors are said to come to country from the stars. They make their way, as I said before, down the Milky Way. Many return there, others sleep in the earth, becoming one with country, as Christ is said to do. Notably for our purposes, the mode by which those beings are said to be related or even reconciled to each other in this cosmic body is that of sacrifice. And I'm talking here about Aboriginal, cosmology. Classically, this is the death of the one which gives life to the many. All you have to do is to meditate on what happens to every growing thing in your back garden if you're lucky enough to have one. Things die, they fall to the ground, they become compost, they are mingled with soil, and the matter of everything that has gone before, and they become the source of everything new that grows. So the one dies so that the many can live. There is no better description of the way in which country lives and moves and has its being, which brings us to the next scriptural image, which is seed. So again, I'm quoting from the Bible, this time from the Gospel according to John chapter 12. Jesus said, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Very truly, I tell you, unless a grain of seed falls into the ground and dies, it remains just a single seed. But if it dies, it bears much fruit." Now, note first of all that in the Gospel of John, the glorification of Jesus is his death on the cross. It's not his resurrection, or his ascension for that matter. For John, the pinnacle of Christ's vocation is the cross, for it is the primary sign in the world of God's hospitality and love. The Cappadocian fathers made much of this when they worked through the doctrine of the Trinity, which in fact they invented. For them, the cross stands for divine love as a radical act of sacrificial hospitality by which the self-centered ego of the one dies to make room for the flourishing of another. Note, second, that the sacrificial death of Jesus is here associated directly with an image from country. The death of a seed in the ground that might become a plant which creates more seeds. This is just how life works 101 for Aboriginal people. Life through death, the fundamental feature of any biosphere, any ecological system that is healthy. To put it plainly once more, Christ is the dying grain, Christ is fruitfulness, Christ is country. Next slide, which brings us to the idea of staple food and drink as a potential site of conversation as well. So I'm going to quote from the book of 1 Corinthians, another letter of Paul, in which this is the earliest description we have of what came to be called the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist in the church. The Lord Jesus, on the night when he was betrayed, took a loaf of bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body that is for you. Do this to remember me." In the same way, he took the cup also after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it to remember me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Now here, according to the oldest tradition concerning the Eucharist we possess, Christ names himself as the staple foods of Mediterranean culture: bread and wine. The basic point here is that Christ is that which gives us life and sustains us in life, because that, my friends, is what staple food does. It keeps us alive. It keeps us in life. The basic point here is that Christ is that which gives us life and sustains us in life. We need him like we need bread. We need him like we need wine. In many Aboriginal cultures, the staples of life are not bread and wine, because that's from the Mediterranean, but the murnong or the daisy yam and the tannin-stained waters of our rivers and creeks. When I was walking with my dad as a very young man in the bush near where we grew up, I said to Dad, "Why is the water so red?" And he said, "That's the lifeblood of the plants and trees and animals all around. They are infused in the water that we drink. And so in drinking the water, we drink of their life, and we are sustained in our life." The secondary point is that eating and drinking Christ under these signs is related to the cycle of life in country that we have already been attending to. Because some forms of life die, other forms of life can live. On the eschatological saying, "until he comes," at the end of the passage I quoted from, an Aboriginal preference for place over time might render this to mean Christ is always coming. By his going in death, as country, he comes to us in life. Christ is always leaving. Christ is always dying, but Christ is always coming. Christ is always being raised from the dead. In this sense, there is not simply a second coming of Christ any more than there is a second coming of the resurrection, but a third, a fourth, a thousandth, a millionth, and so on. Christ is always dying in order that he may come to us again alive, just as country does. So this is another site of conversation between Aboriginal spirituality and theological tradition from the colonial church. Next slide, please. I want to talk now about ancestral voice, and this one will probably be a slightly trickier one because I'm going to draw on parts of Scripture which almost never come up in church. So I want to read to you from Hebrews, the book of Hebrews. We don't know who the author was. Chapter 7, where it says this: "This King Melchizedek of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham as he was returning from defeating the kings and blessed him. Without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he remains a priest forever. It is even more obvious when another priest arises resembling Melchizedek, one who has become a priest not through a legal requirement concerning physical descent, but through the power of an indestructible life. For it is attested of him, that is Christ in the passage, you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. Now, some of you may be unaware of the Hebrew story that this is bouncing off. So in the book of Genesis, you read this story about Abraham wandering around the land that was called at the time Canaan. And while he's going, he's actually making all of these treaties with the local indigenous people. And one of the indigenous leaders that he comes across is actually this chap called Melchizedek, who seems to be both a king and a priest in a place that is now called Jerusalem, but was then called just Salem, or a place of peace. And because out of his treaty obligations to some of the Canaanite kings, he's actually gone out in battle with some of them against their enemies. When they come to the place that is called Salem, King Melchizedek, who is also known as a priest of Elohim, which is an indigenous word for God, says to Abraham, let me bless you in the name of Elohim, our God. And Abraham, rather than saying something like, oh no, you can't do that because my God is Yahweh, says, sure, go ahead. And so he receives the blessing of Melchizedek. This later tradition in Hebrews, which is reflecting upon that story and saying that Jesus is like Melchizedek, who was understood to be someone who was not born as everyone else is born, who was just always there, who never died as everyone else dies, but lives on, who was never ordained as a priest in a human tradition, such as that of the priesthood of the Jews or the priesthood of the Christian church, but receives a priesthood, as it were, of creation, because Melchizedek and Jesus, according to this Hebrews tradition, is someone who acts as a go-between the divine, which is country, and the human community. And so here Jesus is named a person who stands between the divine and those the divine has created. But this priesthood does not derive from the order of Aaron, nor from the Christian church, but rather he is a priest of the order of Melchizedek, that indigenous priest of the people of Canaan, who met and blessed Abraham in the name of El Elyon. Melchizedek's priesthood is presented by the writer of this letter, this epistle to the Hebrews, as a priesthood from creation itself, from country. For it does not derive from human reproduction, cultures, or institutions in any way. Like the Son of God, he is said to live yet without beginning or end. Now, to Aboriginal ears, this sounds like he is one of our Creator ancestors, who mediate to us the primordial dreaming, who are a voice for this dreaming, who shape country, bless country, and show us how to rightly live in it. So if Christ is a priest in the order of Melchizedek, as the book of Hebrews says, then he is a Creator ancestor. He is like Bunjil, he is like Wah. His is the voice we hear when we have lost our way. So again, this concept of an ancestral voice is a site for conversation between our two traditions. We're getting there now. Number 4. Number 5. Yep. So again, quoting from Scripture, Matthew chapter 13. This is Matthew's, chapter about parables that Jesus told. So Jesus put before them another parable, saying, "The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that someone took and sowed in the field. It is the smallest of all the seeds, But when it has grown, it is the greatest of shrubs and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches." Now, I cite this parable because it's an example of the unique way that Jesus apparently taught his disciples. Many of his stories, some would argue almost all of his stories, were built upon his observation of the non-human world. His intimate knowledge of the ways in which seasons and weather systems unfolded, and the ways in which plants and animals lived and died. In this sense, Christ is not only himself country, he not only says, "I am the seed that falls to the ground and dies in order to create fruit," but he's also a teacher about country, an elder who seeks to initiate the human community into the ways of country. To Aboriginal ears, he is therefore a custodial elder, one who teaches others how to hear what country is saying and to respond with imitation and obedience. Again, another site of conversation between our two traditions. That's Auntie Patsy Cameron, by the way, one of the custodial elders of my country. Next slide. So this is all very interesting and, food for thought, as they say. But how does it all hit the ground? What might the implications be for a community, a Christian community, which wants to take some of these things, these sites of conversation, seriously? What might the implications of some of these understandings and frameworks and teachings be for the way that we live our lives, that is, we do ethics, and the way that we worship, that is, we do liturgy or ritual? Well, I'm glad you asked. Allow me to conclude this modest proposal with a couple of slides concerning its implications for Christian liturgy and ethics on country. For we can no longer think about our lives as separated. Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander and colonial settler peoples have been living with each other in this country for 235 years now. Yes, that living with each other has overwhelmingly favoured the settler. It has overwhelmingly meant genocide for mob and ecocide for country. But we cannot begin again from a different place. We cannot restart this history and do it another way. We are here with each other now, with all the legacies of our violent history. What matters now is that we share this country now. Our sovereignties, if you like, are intertwined and even entangled. This simple fact now presents us with an opportunity to choose a different kind of future together on country, not one that pretends that the last 235 years haven't happened, one that hears that and takes that seriously and understands its legacies for the present. But we can nevertheless make a future in which we together care for country and for each other according to the rubrics of a commonly chosen ethics and a commonly designed worship that draws on the wisdom of all our traditions. So let's begin with ethics. What might a common Christian ethics look like on country if it takes country seriously? Well, the command to love God might now include a sense that God is not simply the other person, whether they be a member of the Christian community or not. It might now include a sense that God is the ecosphere, the biosphere, the environment, land, animal, country. And therefore, the command to love God must include all of that. The command to love the neighbour might now include neighbours of the furred, beaked and scaled variety. The baptismal vow to turn away from evil and turn towards Christ might now become a prophetic resistance of simply human-centred social imaginaries and a visionary call to ecological compassion. Is that what's in our mind as we baptise people? If it isn't, let's change that. And the next slide, some implications for a common Christian liturgy on country that takes country seriously. What of our worship, the ceremony by which we remember and dramatise our most deeply held convictions about the way things are and the way things ought to be, because that is what ritual is, folks. It is a dramatisation, a storying in body and community and earth of our most deeply held beliefs and sense of vocation about the way things are and ought to be. Nothing less than that. So the naming of the divine might now include those of local creator ancestors. If there are so many names for God in the Christian texts themselves, why not include a few others? Why not include some of the names of the creator ancestors that are part of the country that you actually worship on, so that you are attending to the divine in those voices and not simply in the voices that have come from the Middle East via Europe? The naming of neighbours in liturgy might now include those of our furred, beaked and feathered kin. Most churches have a time of sort of intercessory prayers for the church and the world, do they not? Okay, some don't. But certainly in my experience, most do in one way or another. But why are those prayers always about human beings? Why are they rarely prayers for country, for its flourishing, for its life? Because we depend on it, and we cannot be who we are unless country flourishes. What about in liturgy and ceremony the naming of divine action, which might now include the movement of rivers, forests, oceans, mountains, microclimates, animals, birds? So much of our liturgy seems to assume that God comes to us from somewhere outside of ourselves, outside of our system, outside of our country, outside of our human community. And we almost implore this God to come and rescue us from the stuff that we're doing within our system, within our country, within our human community, and so on. But what if God is these things, these places, these communities, this country? That speaks both of the vulnerability of divine action and presence, vulnerable to all that we terribly do to each other and to our country, but it also speaks of the resilience of the divine to resist the worst that we can do to each other and to country. So let's, in our ritual, name these dual movements of the divine. Explicitly, the naming of evil might now include the ongoing colonial assaults on country, not only on its people, but on country itself. Because every genocide is accompanied by an ecocide. You only have to watch what's going on in Palestine at the moment to know that. Country is crucified and cries out in pain. So let's name its pain and name our responsibility for it and our responsibility to do something about it. That would be the Aboriginal way. That would be the Christian way if country was taken seriously in Christian theology. So look, that's it. That's all I got. Some things to go on with. What I'm suggesting that you might do now, just for, say, the next 10 minutes or so, is get together in a little group of maybe 3 or 4 or 5 with the people near you. If you don't know each other, introduce each other. And then, in that group, just ask yourself the simple question. It's a question that's asked in spiritual direction kind of settings over and over again, is what struck you? What resonated with you? And why is that important to notice?